Hi there. I'll wait for that to finish. I think I'm going to take that as a cue to make a start. We're just at 1 minute past 9, and we should get started here. So, first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Gideon Henderson. I'm the Chief Scientific Advisor at the UK Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all this morning, on this Monday morning, to the beginning of the Adaptation Day agenda on the UK Pavilion. It doesn't matter whether you arrived this morning or whether you were here for the whole of last week. I think you will be well aware that there's been a big push over this COP meeting on reducing emissions and keeping the goal of 1.5 degrees centigrade alive. There has been a strong mitigation push, in other words. But 1.5 degrees of warming is still change. It will take the planet to a warmer condition than it's been in for at least the last 120,000 years, and it's happening really quite rapidly. Change is already happening, of course. We see that in floods and fires in the last year or so. We see the stress on ecosystems on land and in the ocean. And of course, we see the challenge to communities and society across the world as well as a consequence. These challenges will get worse, even if we are successful in achieving the goals of this COP meeting. So today is Adaptation Day at COP. But like mitigation, adaptation really needs to feed through the whole of climate science and climate policy. Indeed, the subjects are closely intertwined. The less well we mitigate, the harder the challenge of adaptation. And if our mitigation strategies are not aware of climate change and resilient to them, then they will fail. To adapt, we must identify climate risks, we must prepare for them, and we must do so well in advance. And that's what this morning panel is aiming to discuss and to think about. How do we prepare in advance for our climate adaptation challenges? So we aim to show you how evidence-based risk assessment can be used to develop strong national adaptation plans and the prioritization of those adaptation actions. We also seek to show you how the action must be local. Mitigation, of course, has to also occur. The actions have to happen locally. But it's a global problem because the CO2 in the atmosphere doesn't care where it came from or where it goes to. But adaptation is at its very heart a local challenge. The climate changes differently everywhere, and the people are impacted, and the ecosystems are impacted differently everywhere. So we have to be thinking about this at a local scale. So we will show this local scale by focusing initially on the UK approach to climate adaptation, and then widening this out to look internationally, and then with a particular focus on Latin America. We have a fantastic panel of speakers to join us today, all of whom are really expert in the subject. So I'm going to leave it to them to say more later when we get to the speaker section. But first, I'd like to welcome our keynote speaker this morning, Minister Joe Churchill. Thank you, Joe, for joining us. Minister Churchill is Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at the department I work in, Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Joe came to politics from a career in retail and the building sector. She's got strong personal interests in cancer, in women's issues and environmental issues. She was first elected as a Member of Parliament for Bury St Edmunds in 2015 and has been twice re-elected there. Following a previous ministerial position at the Department of Health and Social Care, with the little challenge of COVID to worry about during that time, she's obviously ready for a new challenge and has come to join us in DEFRA from September this year. Her portfolio includes science and innovation, of course close to my own heart, but also environmental management and regulation, and of relevance here today, climate mitigation and adaptation. So I'm delighted that Minister Churchill is opening Adaptation Day for us on the UK Pavilion. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Gideon, and for so eloquently laying out the challenges we have before us. So, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speakers, I'm delighted to welcome you to this opening session on Adaptation, Loss and Damage Day, which will highlight the importance of understanding climate risk to inform decision-making on adaptation. We are in the decisive decade for tackling climate change. Already at the summit, I'm sure you will agree, we have seen some great progress together. Notably, over 120 countries have endorsed the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forests and Lands, and billions of dollars have been committed to the Global Forest Finance Pledge. Now, it's absolutely vital that we do all we can in Glasgow and beyond to keep our goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees alive. But sensibility says we must also be prepared for every eventuality. The UK's average temperature has warmed by 1.2 degrees since the pre-industrial period. Children born today could see global warming reach around 3 degrees within their lifetimes, or even higher, should we fail to effectively implement the Paris Agreement. I have my first granddaughter arriving into the world in the next 10 days. I'd like us all to think of those granddaughters and grandsons across the world when we're working on this together. Now, people and nature across the world are already being impacted by the consequence of climate change, with the poorest and the most vulnerable impacted the most. Adapting and becoming more resilient to the challenges climate change poses is vital for us all, not only to survive, but to thrive. As we work rapidly to cut our emissions towards achieving net zero, we must also integrate actions so our societies adapt to the risks posed by a planet that is warming. Indeed, our very net zero strategies should be resilient to stand up to the test of time. As Gideon said, adaptation is not an alternative to mitigation, and neither is it sufficient alone. Our low-carbon infrastructure should be able to withstand more frequent extreme weather events. As the energy efficiency of our building is improved, they must also be protected from overheating. The trees we've planted to draw carbon from the atmosphere will only help us achieve net zero if they can survive the threats that warmer temperatures could bring. And our precious peatlands, which store so much carbon, must be resilient to the impacts of drought and the changes in rainfall patterns. Embedding climate resilience and adaptation into the heart of our efforts to tackle climate change and recover from the pandemic is a top priority for the UK. And at the Climate Ambition Summit in 2020, the UK became one of the first countries in the world to fulfill a key commitment of the Paris Agreement by publishing our first adaptation communication. We provided a short update in October this year to signal our ongoing commitment to sharing progress and reporting on the adaptation action that we're taking domestically and globally. To do that successfully, we need science, research, innovation to inform the solutions that respond to all scales of climate risk, from national to local, as Gideon said, and by all of us in society. The UK has a deep and a broad research base which supports policy making and action across government, including our ambitious approach to climate change adaptation, which is underpinned by a strong statutory framework. The Climate Change Act of 2008 obliges the UK government to prepare for the risks associated with climate change, including heat waves, flooding, and extreme storms. The Climate Change Committee is integral to this. It ensures the most up-to-date research and evidence is available to inform plans and policies in the UK. We welcome the recent publication of the Independent Assessment of UK Climate Risk, which pulls together the evidence and analysis from over 450 experts from 130 organisations, presenting a clear, comprehensive picture of the challenges that we are facing. We have plenty of work to do. The risk assessment will be translated into action through national adaptation programs in the 4 nations of the United Kingdom as we collaborate to adapt to the challenges of climate change. All of this means that action on the ground is rooted in robust and innovative science from key partners across the country and beyond, and we will continue to press on with research to sustain that approach. This includes the Met Office's Hadley Centre Climate Programme, which provides the UK climate projections. This climate analysis tool offers unprecedented spatial detail on how the climate may change over time. The UK Climate Resilience Programme, which supports adaptive endeavours on both national and regional scales through action-orientated research, working directly with those oh-so-important local communities. And Climate Services for Net Zero World, a programme that partners a consortium of research institutions with the UK government, providing leading-edge scientific knowledge and transformative advice on the impacts of climate change. These examples of excellence from UK institutions are complemented by collaborative working with scientists from around the globe to build adaptive capacity and enhance resilience. For example, the UK-funded Future Climate for Africa research programme, known as the FCFA, has delivered major advances in our scientific understanding of African climate variability and change, improving continent-wide predictions of the impacts of climate change. Crucially, the FCFA also tackles the challenge of how to translate this new science into applicable actions to reduce risks faced by governments, businesses, most importantly, communities on the front line. Novel collaborative approaches between researchers and decision makers have helped build the climate resilience of the cities across southern Africa, improved flood risk management in West Africa, and improved water security in East Africa. Climate change adaptation also requires research and action to improve our response to humanitarian disasters in the face of more severe climate extremes. Our Science for Humanitarian Emergencies and Resilience Research Programme has enabled researchers to join forces with humanitarian agencies to improve how disaster risks are anticipated and responded to, saving time, money, and importantly, protecting lives. These examples are just a snapshot of how the government is committed to driving science, research, and innovation through strong partnerships that value inclusion and diversity. We are championing this approach across all of our COP26 goals. You will hear about the innovative Adaptation Research Alliance this week. This alliance, known as the ARA, is a new international research collaboration aiming to transform how adaptation research is targeted, coordinated, and conducted, linking knowledge firmly with action to develop adaptation solutions that are driven by the needs of local communities. Overall, ladies and gentlemen, it is abundantly clear that science has been and will continue to be absolutely vital in understanding the challenges we face from climate change and how we effectively respond to them. I am sure that today's discussion will continue to inspire you to work together for a more adaptive and resilient future for everyone. Thank you.
Very many thanks, Minister Churchill, for laying out the ambition of the UK and your vision for the importance of climate adaptation and adaptation science. I should mention there's one spare chair in the corner here. Don't all rush at once, but if one person wants to join, please do come in. So to introduce you to the format of the rest of this session, we're going to have 4 10-minute presentations from the 4 panelists that you see in front of you. We won't really allow time for questions between them unless you have a real point of information question about those talks. But there will be time for Q&A at the end, and we hope there'll be enough time to have a real dynamic conversation in the room about the comments that we will have heard preceding that. So for now, we're going to get straight on with talks from our experts. And let me first of all introduce to you Professor Richard Betts. Richard is Head of Climate Impacts Research at the Met Office Hadley Centre in the United Kingdom, and also a professor at the University of Exeter. He's a lead author in preparation of the 6th Assessment Report of the IPCC, and he's played an important part in UK adaptation science, directing publication of the technical report for the recent 3rd Climate Change Risk Assessment, and also ensuring linkages to work on UK climate projections. Richard, please tell us about those things. Thank you.
Thanks, Gideon, and thank you everyone for coming today. So I'm just going to kick off by giving a brief overview of this huge report that we wrote, giving the technical advice underpinning the independent assessment, which feeds into the CCRA3. To start with, it's worth pointing out that we've already changed the climate. The graph on the left there, that's Met Office data showing global average temperature changes year by year from 1860 up to last year relative to the end of the 19th century. So the blue bars going down where the years where it's colder than that average at the end of the 19th century, the orange bars going up are the warmer years. And you can see that obviously the world has warmed substantially over the last century. The world has warmed by over 1 degree Celsius globally over the 20th century. And it's continuing to do so. And one of the things that has done, it has actually increased extreme weather events, the severity and the likelihood of many types of extreme weather events. Now, we can actually attribute these changes to climate change. I've just put 2 examples only from this summer on the slide here. At the top, some research announced last week here at COP26. Colleagues of mine at the Met Office have studied the 2021 European heatwave, the record-breaking summer, and that would have been essentially impossible to have temperatures at that level without human influence on climate. Then at the bottom, again this summer across Western Europe, sadly over 200 people were killed by flooding in Germany and Belgium. And again, that's been calculated by another team of climate scientists at the World Weather Attribution Group. They assessed that the rainfall intensity increased by up to 19% due to climate change. So we have increased extreme weather already, and we have to adapt to that now. So this is where we are. We've warmed the world by over 1 degree, 1.1, 1.2 in the last few years. We're aiming to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, of course, under the terms of the Paris Agreement, ideally pursuing efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Now, for the risk assessment purposes, we don't know what warming we need to be accounting for when we're assessing what the risks are to the UK and the rest of the world and how we need to adapt to that. So we look at a range of different scenarios for that. One of the scenarios we look at assumes that we do just about meet the terms of the Paris Agreement. So this is what that global temperature graph could look like by the end of the century if we just about meet Paris and limit warming to 2 degrees. But if we don't meet the terms of the Paris Agreement, if we don't put in place the mitigation that is urgently required, as the Minister said earlier, we could be on track for approximately 3 degrees global warming by the end of the century, but that's the best central estimate. In actual fact, there's a wide range of possibilities for that. It could be anywhere between just above 2 and over 4 degrees global warming by the end of the century with currently implemented policies. I don't mean the NDCs. The NDCs are pledges. The policies implemented on the ground are currently taking us to anywhere between 2 and 4 degrees global warming by the end of the century. So for the risk assessment, we looked at the upper end of that to assess whether the UK and the rest of the world is prepared for those kind of levels of warming. So we looked at a 4-degree scenario for the risk assessment. What would that mean in terms of global sea level rise? So this graph here shows 2 scenarios of sea level rise. One where global temperatures reach 2 degrees warming by the end of the century, and one where they reach 4 degrees by the end of the century. And you can see in both cases the global sea level is still in an upward trajectory, even in the scenario which stabilises temperatures at 2 degrees warming by the end of the century. So in that scenario, which meets the terms of the Paris Agreement, we could still be committed to sea level rise of between 0.3 and 0.5 metres by the end of the century. So still substantial sea level rise already locked in, even in a Paris-compliant world. But in a non-Paris compliant world, where we possibly 4 degrees warming by the end of the century, it could be up to 1 metre global sea level rise, possibly even more. The recent IPCC report, which came out in the summer, did assess low likelihood, high impact scenarios of more than 1 metre sea level rise by the end of the century. And we accounted for these in the assessment as well. So I'm just going to give a few examples of some of the climate hazards which lead to the risks which we're assessing in the independent assessment. So this looks at high temperatures and risks of heat stress and implications for human health and well-being. So the map on the left there, that shows the UK temperature change in a 4-degree global warming world reached in the 2080s, and it's from the UK climate projections. It's the 90th percentile, so up near the upper end of the RCP 6.0 scenario, so not a high emissions scenario, a sort of medium high emissions scenario. It reaches those levels of warming. And the key point from that map is that the warming locally is more than the global average, especially in extreme temperatures, the maximum temperatures. So a 4-degree warming world could mean an increase in UK maximum temperatures of 5, 6, 7, maybe even 8 degrees in certain parts of the country. And that would increase the risk of heat stress and heat-related deaths if we don't take action to adapt to that, improving building design, perhaps changing lifestyles to better live with a hotter world. So currently, it's estimated there's around about 2,000 people per year die from heat-related impacts under the current climate. A 2-degree world in the 2050s, those numbers would rise to 7,000 a year without any adaptation, 13,000 in the UK under a 4-degree world. So numbers go up as you increase warming, clearly, without any adaptation. People will be at increasing risk of flooding as well. We did an extensive assessment of risks of flooding, both from heavy rainfall, river flows, and from coastal flooding. The assessment looked at all those sources of flooding, and it looked at different scenarios of whether we have current adaptation, improved adaptation, and looked at the numbers of people at risk. At the present day, this map shows the different local authority areas, and there's thousands of people currently at risk from flooding. So improved adaptation is already needed for that. Under a 2-degree warming pathway by the 2050s, more people would be at risk of flooding. Again, many thousands more at increased risk of flooding without additional adaptation. And by the end of the century, under a 4-degree warming world, again, even more people exposed to flooding unless more adaptation is put in place. So we're in no way adapted to the levels of warming which are currently in place, which would increase the flooding risk from sea level rise and increased rainfall. And finally, one of the hazards that we looked at in the UK was wildfire, which is not really something that we really kind of that well attuned to in the UK. We do have wildfires, but nowhere near on the scale that we see elsewhere in the world, such as Australia, California, other places. But that is something where the fire weather, so high temperatures, low rainfall, high winds combined, this would increase the risk of fire substantially, especially at high levels of warming like 4 degrees, but even at 2 degrees global warming, we'd see an increase in the number of days where we've got high fire weather risk. So we need to be accounting for those kind of extreme weather conditions in ecosystems and protecting settlements and so on under a warming world. And finally, we didn't just look in the UK, we looked internationally as well, both the risks elsewhere in the world and what that means for the UK. So just to illustrate this, I talked about heat stress earlier. The risks of heat stress are even more severe in the countries which are already hot and especially humid. So the two maps here show the risks of extreme heat stress in a 2-degree global warming world and a 4-degree global warming world, and it's showing the percentage of days with extreme risk of heat stress, which is defined in terms of this metric called wet bulb globe temperature, which combines humidity with temperature. When it's very humid, you can't cool your body by sweating, so that's more dangerous. So into a 2-degree global warming world, about 1 billion people around the world would be exposed to those kind of levels for more than 10 days a year. And that would rise to 3.5 billion under a 4-degree global warming world. So that illustrates just how much of a problem heat is going to be to people across the world. So just to summarise then, the risks from climate change are already increasing. Climate change is here now. We now need to adapt already. Even if we limit warming to the terms of the Paris Agreement, we've got further adaptation will be needed. if we go to a 4-degree warming world, that's even more of a need for adaptation if we need to be prepared for that. The hazards and risks associated with that, they increase more with high levels of warming, so limiting warming reduces the need for adaptation, obviously, but some adaptation is going to be needed. And many of the risks are more severe elsewhere in the world, and that's worth bearing in mind as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Just before we pass on to the next speaker, does anyone have any questions of points of information or short questions for Richard? No. Okay. So our second speaker this morning is Baroness Brown of Cambridge, Dame Julia King. Julia will be known to very many of you in the audience here and online. She chairs the Adaptation Subcommittee of the UK's Climate Change Committee and acts as the UK's Low Carbon Business Ambassador. She's also chair of the Sir Henry Royce Institute for Advanced Materials with its main hub in Manchester. In addition, she is non-executive director of the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, a council member of Innovate UK and a fellow of both the Royal Academy of Engineering and of the Royal Society. And I could go on, but it would be more interesting to hear from Julia herself. Please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Gideon. I absolutely agree with that. So, following on from Richard, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the process for the producing the technical report for the climate change risk assessment, and then what the Independent Climate Change Committee's recommendations to government as a consequence of the report that Richard has been leading for us. So the third climate change risk assessment actually is something the government will produce, and they will produce it next year. So CCRA 3, the UK government's assessment of risk, will be published next year. So this is about the process that goes on in order to advise the government on producing that risk assessment, which happens every 5 years. So Richard has told you about some of the content of a really important core of that, which is the CCRA 3 technical report, which has involved, as the Minister has told us, some 400 plus scientists and specialists, and I can see one or two of our specialists sitting in the audience, so it's great to see them. It has inputs not only from that huge group of people, but crucially from the Met Office's UK CP18 climate projections, which you can find out more about in the Science Pavilion next door. So a good place to go if you haven't been there. The CCC, the Climate Change Committee, also commission a whole range of reports to input to CCRA 3 and to our advice to government. And then from the technical report, we produce national summaries for all of the UK, the 4 UK nations, a whole range of fact sheets, for example, for farming and for other sectors of the economy. And then we produce our independent advice report to the government. And that's what I'm mostly going to be talking to you about. As Richard has said, we are already seeing the climate changing, and as Gideon emphasised, it's changing differently, actually. There are some quite local issues about it. But we're already seeing something like, as the Minister mentioned, 1.1 to 1.2 degrees of warming from pre-industrial. This chart uses a 1981 to 2000 baseline, where the numbers look a bit different. But it says that by mid-century, actually, even if we're on a Paris-compliant path, we're probably going to be seeing more than 1.5 degrees, probably 1.6, 1.7 degrees of warming, sadly. We're going to be seeing, it's much more likely that we will be seeing a heat wave type summer. They will become typical summers by the middle of the century in the UK. We'll be seeing more winter rainfall, but considerably less summer rainfall. And when that rainfall does occur, there'll be a greatly increased likelihood that it comes as short bursts of very intense rainfall, the kind of thing that causes significant surface water flooding in our cities, as we saw in London earlier this year. And as Richard has stressed, of course, sea level rise. And one of the interesting things I think about sea level rise is how local that is as well. Sea level rise in Scotland is significantly lower than sea level rise in the southeast of England because of the changes that relate to the Ice Age, Scotland is still rising relative to England. So these things are all quite local and do need to be looked at a local level. But there's quite a lot of climate change to come, which even if we're on that Paris-compliant path, still needs to be taken into account. As Richard has said, the technical report looked at 61 risks and opportunities from climate change, and it assessed how severe they were, and it came up with the conclusion that I think it's 54 of them really quite urgently need more action, and quite a number of them need more investigation. The other, I think, very important message is that as we move from the present day, even in that 2-degree scenario, the proportion of those risks that turn into high risks increases very significantly. And of course, if we're on a 4-degree pathway, that increases faster and even more significantly. So risk is significantly increasing into the future, even on a 2-degree pathway. And this shows you that actually since CCRA2, a similar exercise was undertaken 5 years ago, the number of risks that the scientists and experts have classified as being in the most urgent category has significantly increased. So adaptation is not keeping up with the rate at which risks are increasing. That's partly because we now have a better understanding of the risks and better projections of future climate, but it's mostly because we're not taking enough action to address the adaptation needs that we have. So risk is significantly increasing, and the impacts of climate change on us in the UK are significantly increasing. But now some good news. We don't actually yet have enough evidence of the benefits of taking climate action in terms of benefits we can monetize, in terms of the economic analysis of it. But where we have that evidence, it's really pretty conclusively positive that actually the benefit-cost ratios, the benefits of taking action, are very, very significant. Some of them up there well over 5-to-1, sometimes right up into 10-to-1. So where we've got the evidence, we can show that it really is worth investing in adaptation. And we invest so much less in adaptation than we invest in mitigation. And we really have got to do something to change that, not to reduce our investment in mitigation, but to increase our investment in adaptation. So one of the things we did was we took those 60, as the committee, we took those 61 risks and opportunities, and we said, well, which ones, to make life a bit simpler for the government, which ones do we really think they need to act on now in the next couple of years? And in looking at that, we particularly looked at what are the key societal goals we've got to be achieving, and what's the key legislation that actually is going to give us an opportunity to move towards those societal goals. So the first of these 4 risks in this list of 8 really high priorities for action now we gave to the government, the first 4 of them are all about nature and farming and our land and crops. And all of these are really crucial if we are going to be able to deliver on the nature-based solutions we need to support us to achieve net zero. We are looking to nature in the UK's net zero plan to deliver in 2050 some 80 megatons of carbon sequestration. As Gideon and the Minister have said, if the trees don't grow, they're not going to be able to do that. We need to be planting, in the government's net zero plan, some 50,000 hectares of new woodlands and forests. We need to be able to find space to do that in the UK. In order to do that, we will need to see an increase in our agricultural productivity of something like 10% per decade in the next 30 years. We're not going to see that unless our soils are able to deliver that, and our soils are being impacted by higher temperatures and flooding and wind and other climate-related problems. So we don't just want to be stuffing more fertilizer into our farmland. We've got to make sure our soils are in good and healthy condition to deliver this in order to deliver net zero. We then, Richard mentioned the the risks, climate risks overseas, we really felt that we need to be paying more attention to that in the UK, because as we've seen during COVID, how crucial our international supply chains are. So we need to know that our international supply chains are healthy, that adaptation is occurring overseas. We all want to grow on drinking coffee and tea, as we've been doing this morning. We need to know the people who are growing the coffee and tea are not suffering from trying to pick it in temperatures that are insufferable to work in. So it's in our interests to make sure we support adaptation overseas, and also that we make sure those supply chains can continue to function. Richard mentioned the very high temperatures we're going to be seeing in the UK. We need to make sure that the homes people live in are fit for them to live in these really hot summers that will be occurring regularly and frequently by the 2050s. So we need to make sure that as we are looking at our building regulations and a new planning bill, that we make the changes that are necessary to make sure that we have hospitals and homes and schools that are fit for the future. We are, and then not just our food supply chains, but we need to recognise that climate change overseas can bring multiple hazards to the UK. And of course, one of the big issues that we will need to think about in the future will be sort of migration and famine and other impacts overseas that will, of course, impact all of us globally. And we need to be making sure that we're thinking about those and thinking about how we can support internationally with adaptation action. So those were the 8 key risks that we very much wanted government to be thinking about in terms of legislation in the next 2 years. We also want to see government integrating adaptation into all of its policy announcements. As Gideon said, adaptation has got to go right through everything. And this is just a list of some important policy announcements we've had in the last 3 or 4 years. The red ones where adaptation doesn't even get mentioned. So our Green Homes Grant was launched without thinking about ventilation and air quality and shading. It was just looked at insulation, and they must be considered together, through to the green ones where actually adaptation has been properly integrated. We need to move all of our policy announcements into that green box. And so one of the other things we did in our advice to government was to say, these are what we think are 10 principles for effective adaptation. And the first one is to have a vision for what a well-adapted UK looks like. What is our adaptation objective? The second is that integration of adaptation into all other relevant policies. The third one is the one that Richard mentioned about 2 and 4 degrees, that we must plan for 2 degrees, but have a risk assessment for what 4 degrees might look like. We must avoid lock-in. So, for example, where we can, we really must stop building in floodplains. We must prepare for the unpredictable extremes, things like the terrible situation in Germany. We must assess interdependencies. The electricity system, for example, when you have a failure in the electricity system, it cascades into all sorts of other areas and causes a much bigger crisis. And of course, by the time we get to 2050, we will be much more dependent on electricity than we are today. So the cascades will be greater and more far-reaching. We must understand thresholds. We tend to assume that things change linearly. When thresholds occur, that can mean our predictions become very inaccurate. Crucially, we must address inequalities. We know climate change exacerbates inequalities both locally and internationally. We mustn't forget there are some opportunities, sadly way fewer than there are risks, but where there are opportunities, we must prepare for them. And we must make sure we have the funding, the resourcing, the metrics and the research in place, as the Minister has said in her speech. So just finally, as Richard has emphasised, climate change is here with us. We are seeing the gap between the action we're taking and the level at which the risk is changing. We're seeing that gap widening, so we are more at risk than we were 5 years ago. As Gideon mentioned, we cannot deliver some of the key government goals, such as net zero, unless we adapt. So it's absolutely crucial when we think of net zero, we think of adaptation alongside it, and we have the funding for adaptation. And we're going to need bold leadership from all of our governments to make sure that nations are prepared for the future climate and to protect the most vulnerable from its impacts. Thank you very much.
Are there any quick questions for Julia? I should also encourage those people who are listening online to bring questions forward on Slido. There's hashtag adaptation with a capital A, and we'll keep an eye on those questions for the Q&A session at the end. So that was a wonderful summary of the UK process of building assessment of climate risk. Challenge for a lot of government departments there, and I noted, of course, the challenge to my own in DEFRA with soils and agriculture and land use being prominent in Julia's remarks. We're now going to widen things out beyond the UK and look internationally for the next two speakers, and the first of those is Dr. Rosalind West. Rosalind is Senior Climate Science Advisor at another UK government department, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. She's responsible for the department's portfolio of research on adaptation, including the Future Climate for Africa programme. She has a research background in climate modelling, so she's well placed to do that. She's also a Fellow of the Royal Meteorological Society, and she represents the UK on the World Adaptation Science Programme. She's currently co-chairing development of the Adaptation Research Alliance for launch at this COP. Over to you, Rosalind.
Thank you very much, everyone. So when we think about climate risk and about adaptation, I think it can be useful to take a bit of a step back and consider first what it is that we're trying to achieve as people and as a planet. Then we can consider how climate change could affect that, so the risks that it poses, and what we can do about it, both through mitigation to reduce the hazards at source, and through adaptation to reduce the exposure and the vulnerability to those hazards. So in 2015, as well as with the landmark Paris Agreement, all countries signed up to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that are shown here. And all countries have committed to achieve those goals by 2030. I'll just say that again because that is in 9 years' time. If we look here at these, at the goals that we've got, it's useful just to look at them and think we've got goals for people, ending poverty, ending hunger, fulfilling our potential and dignity in a healthy environment. Goals for the planet itself, protecting it from environmental degradation, overconsumption, taking urgent climate action. Goals for prosperity, that people can live prosperous and fulfilling lives. That economic, social and technical progress can proceed in harmony with nature. And goals for peace, and importantly, Goal 17, that this happens in partnership and is focused on the needs of the poorest and the most vulnerable. When we start to look at all the goals together like this, we really start to think about how interconnected they are, how essential it is that we consider the links between our social, our economic, our environmental systems in order to achieve and deliver truly sustainable development. But climate change poses a threat to the achievement of all of these goals. Not only that, but it threatens to undermine the important gains that we've made already in trying to deliver these goals. So sustainable development has to be climate resilient development. And so the point of adaptation is to enable us to achieve these sustainable goals, even under a changing climate, and most particularly for the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world. Understanding what that means in practice goes far beyond the really important work that Richard and the team have been doing on trying to understand the climate hazards or their impacts alone. So if we consider the flooding in this informal the hazard of flooding in this informal settlement, to understand the risks that poses, we really need to understand the vulnerabilities of the people here, their homes, their health, their way of life, their livelihoods. And that knowledge and expertise resides with those local communities themselves. And the knowledge, therefore, of how to adapt to that also requires that knowledge. It requires an integration of the traditional and local knowledge with our scientific knowledge. This requires collaboration at a scale that we have never seen before, across disciplines, across societal boundaries, and that have traditionally kept us from working individually on many separate pieces of what we now realise are the same puzzle. So to understand these risks, we really need to engage in this wider scope of transdisciplinary research questions that focus on those human development outcomes. and to inform how we respond to those risks through our action on adaptation and on development, we need local knowledge and expertise alongside that information on the characteristics of climate in the next few decades, and we need it on the scale of decision making. For the FCDO, where I work, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, this directly means that we use science directly to help us ensure that our programmes, our plans and our investments are resilient to climate risk. And we have ourselves recently commissioned a series of regional climate risk reports that have provided the underpinning evidence on climate risk that's relevant to development planning to do just that. They're being developed by climate scientists and social scientists working together in collaboration to ensure that the output is not just about the climate hazard, but really includes this information on exposure and vulnerability to understand how, through our actions and through our investments, plans, policies, we can address these climate risks as a whole. But this is a very time and labour-intensive process, and it requires us to work in new ways. And as I said earlier, we do not have that luxury of time to adapt. And so we really need to coordinate our efforts. And I think this is behoven on all of us to really decide that we are going to work together in this new way in order to address these risks. And to ensure that we are learning from one another and from our different attempts to adapt, and learning from our successes and our failures, that we are addressing the most pressing priorities for the most vulnerable, and crucially that we're learning from one another. And so this is where we're coming to the Adaptation Research Alliance, which the Minister mentioned earlier. This urgency of action and this need to collaborate and coordinate our efforts, I think, requires us to work in an alliance, to work together. So this Adaptation Research Alliance is a new global collaboration that is seeking to catalyse both increased investment and increased capacity to do this action-oriented research that's really driven by the needs of the users, the people who are going to be actually adapting and doing all of this stuff, and to help them create practical and effective adaptation and resilience solutions. This focus on action-oriented research is really based on evidence that taking a user-centred and impact-driven approach really provides much better understanding of the climate risks, but also much better decision-making tools and better practical solutions for affected communities. So to accelerate these and scale investments in action-oriented research in developing countries, this is the mission of the Alliance, that address the most pressing knowledge needs of resilience of the most vulnerable, that builds capacity at all stages from research all the way through to action, that strengthens the linkages between research and implementation and promotes greater learning. And one of the first, so we've been working to develop this alliance over the last 2 years, and since the COP25 when we first had the idea of this, and I'm very excited that we'll be launching it formally tomorrow. And over that time, the community has really grown. So initially there were just a few organisations. In January, when we had the soft launch of it, 30 organisations came together to declare that they wanted to co-develop this alliance together. And tomorrow you'll hear that many, many more organisations have now joined. But we also recognised that we didn't want to just wait until COP26 to be able to launch it, and there was the delay for COP26. So we've actually started getting to work on this important agenda already. One of the first things that we've done is to co-develop a set of research for impact principles. They've really been co-developed by the core membership to guide the activities of the Alliance and its members. To better align and link our knowledge to action. And we really hope that the endorsement of these principles will instigate a systemic change in the landscape of action research, one that really puts the needs of the most vulnerable front and centre. So this set of principles, it really addresses the purpose of research, the research process itself, the value, the benefits of research, and the linkages between research and action. So the first one of these is that research is needs-driven, it's solution-oriented, and that it leads to a positive impact in the lives of those most at risk from climate change, addressing that question of who or what is the research really for. The second one is really about how is that research carried out, that it's transdisciplinary and it's co-produced with the users who are really going to put it into practice. The third is about the value of research, how is that research valued, and that it should really emphasise that societal impact and enabling us to deliver those societal goals, which Baroness Brown also spoke of, and the Sustainable Development Goals. The fourth principle is about building capacity, because this is essential. We cannot just do this with a small group of climate scientists or a small group of social scientists working together. We have to build capacity across all of our systems in order that they can all develop in a way that is climate resilient. The fifth one of these is around addressing structural inequities that lead to increased vulnerability and reduced adaptive capacity of those at risk. So that research and action research really must address those root causes of risk. And finally, the sixth principle is around how can research action links be strengthened. And a key to this, really, especially through the action side of things, is really the learning while doing approach. The learning while doing enables that adaptation action to be evidence-based and to be increasingly effective. And one of our member organisations, the CABI, the Commonwealth Agricultural Bureau International, have already adopted this set of principles and have integrated it into their research strategy. And many organisations have now endorsed these principles, and we really hope that many more will do that. I do have 2 more slides of some examples, but I'm wondering if I'm a bit short of time.
I think perhaps we could leave them and see if they find any questions.
Yeah, sure. So, and also I think that Anna Maria has some really nice examples of this type of working that she's going to come to. So, I will just end with a bit of a call to action. So we have this formal launch of the Alliance tomorrow in meeting room 4 at 11:30. We have a really nice set of speakers there. Ministers from around the world will be speaking about the need for this alliance for action-orientated research in order to inform adaptation. I would also encourage organisations across this spectrum of research to action to join the Adaptation Research Alliance and to engage in its co-development. I would encourage you to endorse these principles, but most importantly, to share your ongoing experience of putting them into practice. And I would also like to make a call to donors, to really join forces to develop new, long-duration, action-oriented research programs that develop people-centred adaptation solutions and really build capacity in the Global South. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosalind. And I was about to ask you a question, but you answered it on your final slide. So let me remind everyone of the plug for the 11:30 launch in room 4 tomorrow of that action. Any quick questions for Rosalind? No. Okay, let's move on to our final speaker before we move to the Q&A section. Again, thinking about this from an international agenda, Dr. Ana Maria Lobo Guerrero, who is involved in a joint alliance between 2 international organisations, the Biodiversity International and the International Centre for Tropical Agriculture, and they joined to form an alliance for which Ana Maria is the research director of climate action. She's also head of global policy research for the organisation Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security in Colombia, where she works to ensure a resilient agricultural sector and good use of climate data. She has a history of work on adaptation in Colombia, including leading development of their national adaptation plan, and she's going to tell us today about broader work in Latin America. Over to you, Ana Maria.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking the organizers of the event for providing me the opportunity to share some of the work that we have been doing in the past years in Latin America in relation to adapting to climate change in the agricultural sector. And I think that this presentation is really nice, follows what Rosalind was mentioning, because this is a real example of action-oriented research. And the Alliance of Biodiversity International CIAD, it's part of the Action Research Alliance that Rosalind was mentioning, because we are really engaged into doing a different part of research that can generate impact on the ground. So I'm going to tell you a story of really how this very simple idea of co-generating climate information for impact at scale in the Latin American agricultural sector took place, and how it started in a very specific country and it spread to many countries in Latin America. Let me start by providing a little bit of context of why did we start working on this project. This started like around 2015, and it was very much based on basing our experience on working with farmers to help them to respond better to climate variability and extremes. And the main conclusion from there was that 3 main things showed up. The first one was Farmers really need climate information, but they have limited access to this climate information. But even when they have access to this climate information, they are hardly able to understand it. And the last bottleneck was that even when they understand this climate information, they don't know how to use it because it is not actionable or contextualized. So basically, what we wanted to do through our efforts was to address these key bottlenecks so that climate information could really be used by farmers to prepare better to climate variability and extremes. So we started working in Colombia. And why Colombia? Colombia is a really interesting country in terms of the agricultural sector and climate, because climate-related factors in Colombia explain around 30 to 60% of variation in yields in different crops. So it was a really interesting case. And then also we had the opportunity of working with a Met office that has great capacity, which was important for the project. So we started implementing this approach, which is a very, very simple idea. But sometimes these very simple ideas prove to be so powerful. And it's this local technical agroclimatic approach, which were roundtables where basically we create the spaces for 3 communities to engage in a dialogue. So we had the climate scientists, the ones that were bringing the climate information to the conversation, that were working with the crop modelers. But then the most important part of this equation was that in these roundtables, the local knowledge through the farmers was part of this conversation. So it was really linking climate scientists, crop modelers with the farmers. And really through this space, we're able to co-generate this agroclimatic information, but going beyond that. We translate this information into something that could be useful to address specific questions for farmers, simple questions, such as when we can plant, when to apply water, when to apply fertilizers, which varieties to use according to this agroclimatic information, which agronomic management practices were the most appropriate given these agroclimatic forecasts. And then we went beyond that because we discussed in these roundtables these questions, and then we translate these into something that we call the agroclimatic bulletins, where basically were documents where we have very specific recommendations for farmers of climate-related practices based on the combination of this local and scientific knowledge. So it was really easy. It was a document which was really easy to follow, which really translated this information into concrete, specific actions that farmers could do on the ground. And therefore, what we have seen, the result of this, is that we believe that we have contributed to transform agriculture in Colombia through 4 main dimensions, which we believe that are totally relevant for this to be a success. The first one, enhancing the confidence in the quality of this agroclimatic information. We also, through these roundtables, were able to democratize agroclimatic knowledge. Then we, through the translation of this information to specific recommendations, we transform knowledge in productive practices. And then something that is really relevant, and we were so happy because from a research perspective, you can really get policies using your research. It's like the dream. So national and institutional policy changes happen because of the implementation of this approach. So little bit of how this work. Of course, we needed to connect the seasonal forecasts with the crop models, and we used different methodologies, and this, of course, was working closely with the Met office in Colombia in order to connect the seasonal forecast and crop models. But the most important part of the approach was really that farmers were part of the generation of these agroclimatic forecasts. So it wasn't information that was coming from up there, nobody knows where, but it was just empowering farmers so that they were part of the process of generating this information. And then also another thing that proved to be very useful was to use digital tools and digital platforms to connect with farmers through these participatory processes. And also something that was totally fundamental because we wanted this to be sustainable was the importance of capacity strengthening and capacity building for the co-design of these information products. So we include many topics in relation to improving seasonal forecast skills and use at the regional, national, and local level. So it was also, for instance, working with the universities at the local level to improve this capacity to not only generate this agroclimatic information, but also to use it. The approach has a very strong science base, which we believe that it's relevant as well. And especially there are some papers that we have been written in relation to this, but especially this one that was published in 2018, which basically, we tell the story of how in Colombia we were able to bridge the gap between climate science and what farmers decide to do on the ground. And then just let me tell you a little bit of the outcomes and impact of the initiative, because it was really interesting. We started working in Colombia, and then this started to spread like a virus, but a good virus. And nowadays, we started in Colombia. Nowadays, we are implementing this approach. And really not we, the institutions that are participating in 11 Latin American countries. You can see them in the map. We have been able to reach more than 250,000 farmers that are receiving this information, but more than that, acting upon this information. We have 60 of these roundtables in Latin America, and we have empowered more than 300 institutions that are using this agroclimatic information and changing the way that they do things. A little bit of focus, assume a specific country. This is the case of Guatemala, which has been really interesting because in Guatemala we have been able to cover 100% of the territory with these roundtables. We have established 19 of these. We have worked together with 100 institutions that are empowered to use this agroclimatic information. We have delivered more than 60 agroclimatic bulletins. And something that is really interesting about this work is that it has been really embedded in the Ministry of Agriculture. Because we didn't, we didn't want this to be only from the research side, but the Ministry of Agriculture in May 2021, they wrote these guidelines for the local governments to implement this roundtable. So very much driven from the Ministry of Agriculture, which was really important for us. At the central level, the regional level, sorry, it was also really interesting what we were able to accomplish in Central America. In Central America, there's something that is called the Central America Climate Outlook Forum, which is really interesting, and it's just really excites me because I think that that's a model to follow. They get all the Met offices from all the countries in Central America. They get together, they discuss the climate information, and then they started using this very same approach. We have been developing with them 5 regional agroclimatic bulletins, and it's really interesting because this has been focused on specific crops such as coffee. We're mentioning coffee, so what's happening with coffee in terms of climate impacts, and we are using these roundtables to get the climate information together and to assess what are the best practices to respond better to these climate challenges. And the other really interesting thing is that we have been able to go beyond Latin America. So we have a very interesting example in Cambodia, where we started to implement the same approach, obviously contextualized to the specificities of Cambodia, but then the farmers are still receiving climate information and acting upon this information. This is my last slide. Just to emphasize the importance of really being able to work at different scales to generate impact with the use of this climate information and to cross-cut all these initiatives with data, with information and knowledge. So we, through this approach, we were able to collect policy and practice at the regional level. So really interesting that these committees, these roundtables, were used by policies to scale out and implement the regional climate risk management strategy in Central America. But we have been also able to connect practice and policy at the national level. So we have been working in specific countries, such as the case of Guatemala that I just mentioned, where policies were using this approach to integrate climate services into their decision-making processes. And then all the way into the local level, because at the end of the day, the farmer is the one that needs to benefit from this. And it's really something that for us was really relevant, that was that it this roundtable promoted institutional changes at the local governments so they could do things different in terms of understanding why this climate information was useful and how they could be part of the co-generation of it and therefore use it to reduce their impacts against climate variability and extremes. Let me finish with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna Maria. Any quick points of information, questions? We haven't had any so far, so I'm assuming not this time as well. So we'll move now to a more general Q&A session. I do encourage people in the room to raise their hands and we'll get a microphone to you. Thank you. I'll come on. Thanks for signalling. I'm going to first of all start with a couple of questions that have been raised on the Slido online. And there's a couple of points that have been targeted specifically at the UK. I'm going to read them out, first of all, and then ask the panel, perhaps all the panel, to respond more generally. The top pick at the moment on Slido is, how is it possible that we can still put out UK government policies without adaptation factored in? This in response, I think, to one of Julia's slides. What more should we in the room and watching online do to stop this? And there's another question, of course they're moving around just at the wrong moment, about, I'd like to find it if I can, about the fact that we already have a lot of knowledge. What we need is action, and we need to make that action happen. And that question finished by asking, what one thing would you do to make that action happen? So my challenge combining those two to the panel is, what one thing would you do to make governments, UK and elsewhere, pay more attention to adaptation? What are the barriers to adaptation and how should we overcome them? And I'll go in the same order as the speakers, perhaps starting with Richard.
Thank you. So, well, I guess the main thing is if it's about personal action, but getting system-level action, it's about using democracy, it's about voting, it's also communicating directly with your elected representatives. And I would say it's not only at government level, also at local level as well. I'm quite active in Exeter, in the Exeter cycling campaign, where we do a lot of work with the local council on making sure that we are improving facilities for cycling and things like that. That's an example of how you can actually influence the process as a citizen.
Democratic action. Thank you, Richard. Julia.
One of the challenges I think we have, which is that there's a perception in government that adaptation is DEFRA's problem. That is, and we really, DEFRA doesn't have the ability to make sure we're building an electricity system that is resilient to climate change. We've got to make sure that we get this message right across government, and that we help DEFRA to influence other departments to really get this embedded across policy. And actually that's why on the Climate Change Committee we have been really pushing so hard to get adaptation linked really closely into net zero and to get that message out that you can't get net zero without adaptation. And indeed the changes that net zero brings to how we operate as a society also have implications for how we adapt. And I think we're hearing at this COP that resilient net zero is becoming much more of a slogan. So I hope that message is getting through. But we certainly on the Climate Change Committee are very keen to be working with DEFRA to get their colleagues in other departments to really pick up this message.
Thank you, Julia. What one thing, Rosalind, would you do to break down the barriers?
I think this is really about bringing people together. So bringing together the researchers, together with the policymakers, together with decision makers at all different levels, getting those people together to really understand where each other are coming from. What are the burning issues that we really need to address? And how can science help us and research, how can that help us to understand what we actually need to do differently? What do we need to change as a result? And to really understand how risks will play out over the future, how that affects what it is that we're trying to achieve, and how we can work together to address that. So I think it's really about bringing evidence into use, but working together to generate that evidence to really understand what the research priorities are that can actually be used in action.
Thank you, Rosalind. Anna Maria.
Yeah, so very similar to what Rosalind just said, but I guess that it's, and from a research point of view, it's not just bringing the evidence, but we researchers need to be able to communicate better our science, because otherwise policymakers are never going to use it. And we need to understand what are the timing and key questions, what are the needs, where are the gaps, and that we can communicate and address those gaps through our science in a way that is useful for them. Because sometimes we believe that our models are going to be used by policymakers, by adaptation plans, but they don't really understand what we do. And so therefore the importance of really communicate it in a simple way that can, and in an actionable way, that can really trigger a decision-making process, I think is very important.
Thank you very much. Let's now move to a question from the room, and there was one at the front here.
Oh, hello. I'm Neil Walmsley from Climate Kick, which is an innovation agency for climate change. I want to ask a question about, from a slightly different angle, the private sector adaptation economy side of this discussion. We've been running a program on behalf of UK Aid in Africa and Asia to support entrepreneurs developing localized solutions. And whilst it's quite wide-ranging, the biggest single area is actually around information, tools and resources. And it's interesting that that's where there seems to be the most commercial potential, actually, where local entrepreneurs take international data sources, combine it with localized data information from a wide variety of things, and then provide that as a commercial service to companies across their region. And it's a rapidly growing area. It seems to be extremely profitable as well for those local businesses that are developing it. So I just wanted to ask whether this was an area that the panelists were looking into as somewhere of potential interest where maybe quite significant impact could be achieved over time.
Rosalind, I wonder if that's a question you might want to take.
Yeah, I could have. I don't think. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep. Sorry. Yes, thank you so much for that suggestion. So actually, you're going to hear tomorrow as part of the Adaptation Research Alliance that we actually have an innovation track as part of that alliance where we're bringing together people who are investing in this type of innovation. I think actually this evening in the Water Pavilion at 7 o'clock, the Global Innovation Fund will be launching a new adaptation and resilience focused innovation fund. And I think that is really important. So thank you very much for raising it.
Thank you. Other questions from the room? There's one in the middle here.
Thank you very much. Mark Sommerfeld from the Association of Renewable Energy and Clean Technologies. My question really relates to the market and how do we get people to take these adaptations seriously. One way of doing that, of course, is making sure they are rewarded appropriately by the market. And in doing that, the problem being is it's often cheaper, of course, to not do the adaptation piece. So if you look at the housing crisis in the UK, it's going to be cheaper to build a lot of cheap housing than it is to build houses that are adapted for climate change. How do we adapt our market so that those rewards can come forward and we see further adaptation taking place?
I wonder if we might get two answers to that, one with a UK perspective and one with a Latin American perspective. Julia or Richard, either of you?
Well, I think the first point is building regulations. Building regulations are being looked at in the UK at the moment, and they do get looked at from the perspective of insulation and net zero homes. We've got to get the message that they need also to be looked at from the point of view of ventilation, shading, cooling, indoor air quality, so that these are really homes for the future. And depending on where those homes are being built, we should also be looking at things like water efficiency. I mean, I come from Cambridge. We're in already a water-stressed area with huge plans for new housing in the area. These need to be homes with extremely high water efficiency standards, and where relevant as well, where we have to build in floodplains, we should be looking at a requirement to build in flood resilience measures. And we should be making sure that the mortgage system counts all of these things into a resilient green mortgage, and make sure that if you buy these houses, you can buy them more cheaply because they're a better investment for the future. And we give all sorts of messages to the consumer in this way to say, that there is a real advantage in having a property of this sort.
Thank you. So paraphrasing, perhaps you're saying that there's a very important role for regulation, but also for financing in that answer. Thank you. Anna Maria.
So I think that a very important topic is being able to, and I'm talking from the agriculture and food systems, which is where I work, traceability. So consumers know where the food is coming from. If it is coming from a deforestation hotspot, what are the practices that were used to produce that meat or that coffee that you are drinking every day. So I think that providing information in an easy way so that consumers can really make informed decisions. You can then decide what you want to eat and put it in your plates, but you need to, your decision needs to be informed. So that's one thing. The other one, in terms of incentives for farmers, it's and it's very much in line to what we have been talking about this participatory research. We have been doing working with communities in Latin America and also through these climate smart villages, where it's just like getting together to understand what are the main risks, but also how these communities are contributing or not to the solution. And we have a really interesting case in Cauca, in Colombia, where we have been producing this coffee, organic coffee, and then what we do is that we put in each one of these bags, we put the story of the farmer, so the farmer behind that coffee. And I think that that's super powerful because people forget, especially people that don't like from urban cities, they forget that food comes from somebody, from a farmer that has been spending time on this, and just bringing that into the product when you decide to buy something or not, even though it could have a higher big price because it has these sustainable practices behind, it really changes the decisions that consumers make. So that's another interesting thing to think about.
Thank you. So again, paraphrasing, it's about getting information into the hands of the consumer. That's a critical thing. And that gives me a chance to plug a later event here on the UK Pavilion about food labelling at 12 o'clock. So if that's a subject of interest, do please come back. Let me take another question from Slido, but do keep them coming in the room as well. There's a question here about the water industry, and particularly it says, what is the UK government doing to support the UK water industry invest in risk assessment? Rather than dealing specifically with UK government policy, perhaps we can think more generally. I could ask Richard to tell us what are the particular water risks that you identified in the work, if you could, and how the UK should adapt to the challenges of water risk.
Yeah, so there's two broad categories of water risk: too little water and too much water. So in the UK, we're projecting, on the whole, hotter, drier summers, particularly in the southeast. And actually, some parts of the UK are already extremely vulnerable to that. I think in London, it would only take 2 consecutive dry winters and 2 consecutive dry summers to really put stress on the system. So contingency planning is already underway for that kind of thing, and that will be even more needed in the future. So you need better infrastructure to be able to be ready to deliver the water, but also emergency responses, if you like. If when we do get shortages of water, what can we do to make sure that people are getting the water to drink, but also businesses can be operating and so on. So you need plans in place ready for when it happens. On the other side of the coin, there's too much water, flooding risk. As I mentioned earlier, flooding risk has already increased. There's been some adaptation already with improving flood defences or flood management, but much more of that is needed as well. So yeah, both those things need to be accounted for.
Thank you, Richard. Please do. Come in.
As part of our Climate Change Act, we do have something called the Adaptation Reporting Power, where the government can oblige the UK's critical infrastructure industries to report on their assessment and planning for climate risk. And the water industry does pretty good climate risk assessments. We assess that on the Climate Change Committee. We still think that there's more that should be being done on leak reduction and on reduction of household and industrial consumption and things. But the adaptation reporting power actually is a very important part of the climate legislation that's perhaps not recognised enough.
Thank you, Julia. That's a nice addition. We have 2 more questions in the room now. So there's one in the blue jumper here, and then we'll move to the back after that.
Thank you. My name is Rhys Blakely. I'm a reporter from The Times. Is it highly likely that some communities in the UK will actually have to move, that they won't be able to adapt in place, that they'll actually have to go and live in different places? What kind of work is being done on that? Do we know how many people are likely to be effective, and what kind of preparations are being made?
And do you have a timescale in mind for your question?
Well, I mean, what kind of timescales are being looked at? Is it the next decade, next 3 decades? I don't know.
I think that's probably one for you to start with again, Richard.
Yeah, so there's not a comprehensive assessment, but there are some examples. The most well-known example is a village called Fairbourne in North Wales, which is already pretty much at sea level. It's a population of a few hundred there. As sea levels rise, which, as I said, a certain amount of sea level rise further is inevitable. There's been a lot of work done with the local community and the Environment Agency and others to decide within the community what is going to be happening as a response to that, and which parts of the village may ultimately need to be abandoned to the sea, essentially. So the work is happening with the community on that. That's one example. I think more needs to be done to assess where some of these will be happening across the country. Yeah.
Anyway, do you want to come in on that quickly, Julia? No?
Just quickly, I mean, the Climate Change Committee produced a report about 2.5 years ago called Managing the Coast in a Changing Climate. And I think that had a very strong message that, not in the next 10 years, but as we look forward in the next 50 years or so, we will have a number of challenges around the coast. And we have a very simple thing we could do in the new planning bill, which is really to integrate the shoreline management plans we have for what is going to happen at the coast, to really properly integrating those into our local plans, so that we can actually start this planning and start engaging with the communities as early as possible. Because as we've heard, engaging with communities on adaptation for them to understand what needs to change and what needs to happen as soon as you can is absolutely crucial.
So those answers and previous questions do sort of hint that the biggest stress to communities in the UK will come from water, too much or too little of it. But that's definitely not always the case as you move around the world in terms of how communities will be impacted. There was a question at the back in the white shirt.
Yes, thank you. Hi, I'm Paul Watkis. So I was one of the CCRA 3 authors and led the methodology and also the economic analysis. We've been doing this since 2009. We're on our CCRA 3 already, so we've been doing this for a long time. I think we have a very good economic case now in the UK. So we estimate that if we do nothing, the economic costs, even in the 2040s, even for a 2-degree scenario, will be 1% of GDP each year. And as Julia shows, we're now collating some nice estimates on the economic benefits of adaptation, although those are societal, not private benefits. So the question is, what are we missing? And I just wonder, I want to sort of ask the audience, and also be cheeky perhaps, Gideon, and ask you, is the problem the way that we're doing this in terms of the governance? And in the UK, we use what's called a mainstream approach. So we mainstream by integrating adaptation through other departments rather than coming down with a very top-down and upstream approach. And I think the question is that approach going to work, that iterative approach, that incremental approach in government, or do we need to do something else? And is it now timely for DEFRA and others to work together with a much more strategy that comes down from higher levels of government and really tries to push ahead with adaptation over the next decade? Thank you.
Well, I'm technically the chair of this, not the responder, but I'll say a few words and then I'll pass over. So I think that it is timely to think about this and act about it now, because we have the technical report from CCRA 3. There is a requirement for a government response to that report, and Julia's mentioned some of that already. And so it makes it a good opportunity to really think again about how we embed adaptation, science and policy correctly across the UK and see greater action before we get to CCRA 4 than perhaps we achieved between CCRA 2 and 3. So I think it's timely, and I perhaps won't say more than that, but I would be interested to hear the views of my UK colleagues about, in response to your question, should we be doing more to make it a top-down process, or is the system fit for purpose but just not quite delivering? That's a question to you, I think, probably, Julia.
I think what's lacking, and what we've said in in our report to government is we need this vision for what a well-adapted UK looks like, or an adaptation objective. It won't be like net zero, because it isn't as simple as that, unfortunately, but this objective that we're aiming for, so that we know what really are clear about what we're measuring progress towards, and so that we can be clear with people about what protection, if you like, the government can provide, and what resilience they have to build in for themselves. Because I think we're not yet able to have that discussion very clearly with the population in the UK.
Thank you very much. Well, this is an international meeting. We've had several questions about the UK, so I would like to widen it back out again. And there's a question that's come in on Slido, which does have a UK flavour to it, but it's how is the UK helping developing nations in Africa increase their resilience? I wonder, Rosalind, perhaps you could say something in general about how Africa should be increasing its resilience and UK role in that.
Yes, absolutely. My work in Africa is particularly on the science and on our research program and the Future Climate for Africa program, but that feeds into the work that goes on across the whole network of country offices and the regional offices that are there that are really implementing the development programming across the continent. And so I suppose that if I talk about Future Climate for Africa, maybe that's my area, so it might be a better place for me to start. So, in the west of Africa, we have a project there that's really understanding the climate, and that's understanding how mesoscale convective storms that are known as megastorms in the press, how they have been increasing over the last 30 years due to climate change, and what we can do to really improve the flood protection in cities across West Africa to reduce the impacts of those types of storms. In East Africa, we've been working with the High Crystal Programme that's really been looking at water security. It's been looking at the risks of flooding and droughts in the region, that's been looking at how we can incorporate that information into national adaptation plans, and also into really understanding how it impacts on the livelihoods, particularly in informal settlements in East Africa. And in Southern Africa, we've really been looking at the climate resilience of cities through the Fractal programme that the Minister mentioned earlier. And that's been a very interesting project because of the way that it's operated, that has brought together people from across all different areas working in the city, different civil society organisations, different parts of local government, and climate scientists, brought them all together to really identify what are the burning issues for this city, how is climate change going to affect that, and what can we do about it over the future. So I think there's been a whole range of different areas where we've been working. Thanks.
Thank you. We're very nearly out of time. I would like to give time for one more question for the room who's been signalling for a while, as long as it's quick. We've got to have question and answer in a minute. Okay? Far away.
Hi, thank you. My question is about the announcement last week from the Glasgow Net Zero Alliance, Financial Alliance for Net Zero, I think committing over $100 trillion towards net zero. How can we make sure that's also resilient?
So that's going to be tough to answer in 1 minute. Does anyone volunteer? I'm not seeing anyone stepping up for that. It's a big challenge.
I want to see $100 million for adaptation around the world alongside that, because we need to recognise we need to be investing in both, and not taking money from decarbonisation, but putting more money into adaptation.
This microphone on. Yeah, thank you. It's a good answer, and I said at the beginning, this is Adaptation Day. We don't see a mitigation day at this COP, and that demonstrates what's sometimes an imbalance in the way that these two things are seen, but they're both, of course, absolutely critical. So it's a well-posed question with which to finish. Thank you for raising that. We do have to finish on time, so I'm just going to make a couple of statements to wrap up. I know there are many other questions. I've seen several other hands raised here at the end of the session, and there were some excellent ones online. One about how we really develop metrics for adaptation, which is fascinating. I would have loved to hear the panel's responses to that question and others. I think some of the panel at least will be around afterwards, so do carry on engaging with them afterwards. I'm delighted that Minister Churchill has stayed with us for the session, and I know she's also keen to hear more and engage more, so do use this opportunity to meet afterwards. I'd like to just say a couple of words about some of the flavours we've had here. We've identified the fact that it's not just about mitigation, but we have to adapt because we know climate is changing. We've listed a number of the major adaptation challenges that we face, from sea level, heat stress, inland flooding, wildfire, etc., and that you can read more about them in the technical report that Richard led. We've looked at the UK and used it as an example of local challenges and how adaptation is a local issue, and we've seen powerful examples of that internationally as well. I love some of the maps that Ana Maria showed us of Latin American region to demonstrate how it needs to be at local level. I also found it striking, the cost-benefit analysis that we saw for the UK, and I'm sure that's true elsewhere, with a cost-benefit of 5 or more for many activities. We learned that communication is critical. We've got to get information into the hands of the people who make the decisions, both the policymakers, but at a local level in communities, and that's clearly a mission for all of us to go away and think about more. And that's perhaps a place to finish, is that we need to be aware of the people and the communities and the ecosystems and nature that are being impacted by climate change. That's where adaptation has to happen. That's where we need to solve all of the challenges of adaptation. We've heard lots of wonderful examples from the panel and a wonderful opening remarks from Minister Churchill. I'd like to close by thanking you all ever so much for your interactions and thanking the audience for coming along and your excellent questions. Thank you.
Stay with me.